My name is Jacinta Hastings. I'm CEO of Bodywhys, the Eating Disorders Association of Ireland. And in collaboration with our partner Sea Change, Ireland's organisation dedicated to ending mental health stigma, we're bringing this webinar to you tonight on hidden challenges. So this evening's event features some live presentations. Throughout, you can submit your questions and comments through the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. At the end of the presentations, we will hold a live panel discussion with our contributors, and we will try to get as many of your questions in as possible. Please note, only the speakers can use their cameras and microphones at this webinar. I think it's just come up on the screen. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag EDAW2022 and make sure that you tag us at Bodywhys and at Sea Change Ireland. We'll have a comfort break during the session, and we'll do our best to keep to time. So if I can just remind you not to share your attendee link with anybody else. We're recording the event, and the recording will be made available publicly. So now, without further delay, I am delighted to launch proceedings and introduce our first speaker, Sea Change Ambassador Brodie Thompson. Brodie was born and raised on a sheep farm near Geraldine, New Zealand. She threw in the gumboots in exchange for travelling the world and now calls Dublin home. Her experience with mental health difficulties began in her early years as she developed bulimia nervosa at age 10 and went on to struggle with anxiety and depression in her teen years onwards. Now 31 years old, Brodie shares her lived experience to break down the stigma that surrounds mental health. She's empowered by the platform Sea Change provides, as it has enabled her to break down her own self-stigmas and feel comfortable in accepting and acknowledging her mental health difficulties and bisexuality. After an experience as an exchange student to Japan at 15 years old, she knew she needed to embark on study and a career path that would enable her to travel. She studied a bachelor's degree in education and art history at the University of Otago, New Zealand, and worked as a primary school teacher. After moving abroad to London, a career in marketing came calling, and she has been working in the field for the past 6 years. However, she's obsessed with charity shopping and thrifts her way around Dublin in the name of sustainability. 2018 was the year she decided to boycott the fast fashion clothing industry and think more ethically and environmentally friendly about her wardrobe. And she doesn't think she'll look back. Her wardrobe is curated through recycled clothing, sourced from charity shop finds, hand-me-downs, and other secondhand vintage purchases. She loves art, photography, socializing, exploring, and anything else that evokes happiness and promotes a healthy well-being, like riding her e-bike around the streets of Dublin. Over to you, Brodie.
Thank you so much for the introduction there, Jacinta. So yeah, hey, I'm Brodie Thompson, and my pronouns are she and her. Yeah, as Jacinta said, I was raised on a sheep farm near Geraldine in New Zealand, and yeah, decided to throw in the gumboots in exchange for travelling, and now I call Ireland home. I'm obsessed with charity shopping, as you would have heard Jacinta say, and yeah, in my spare time, I can be found thrifting my way around Dublin in the name of sustainability. Additionally, in my spare time, I volunteer as a Sea Change ambassador, and this has been one of the best decisions I have ever made. As passionate as I am about curating a sustainable wardrobe, I'm even more passionate about ending the stigma that surrounds mental health and eating disorders. We, as people, connect with authenticity, and Sea Change provides a platform for those with lived mental health experiences to share their stories. To end stigma, we need to give it a face and a name, and that's why I'm here sharing my experience with you. And I also want to be the voice that I wish I'd heard when I felt so alone and ashamed. I'm not an expert in understanding mental health, but I am expert in knowing my lived experiences and knowing how stigma has affected me. By talking about my experiences, I no longer feel shame. Sea Change is Ireland's national mental health stigma reduction partnership, and they work in partnership with various Irish organisations like Bodywhys to open minds about mental health problems and then end mental health stigma and discrimination. And Sea Change's vision is that everyone in Ireland can be open and positive about mental health, understanding it as a normal part of ups and downs of life. I've never had an easy relationship with the person I see in the mirror, which stems from a youth of living with an eating disorder. I first started on the journey of bulimia when I was at primary school, which gave me a secret I felt I had to hide, but also a sense of control in a turbulent time of my life. It was a sense of control I didn't want to share, a sense of control I didn't want others to know about, and a sense of control I didn't want to lose. The sense of control made me feel like I had a secret life that I would never feel comfortable with sharing. When I started being bulimic, I didn't know that what I was doing had a name. But as I got into my teen years, my secret life started to take over. I was consumed with negative thoughts. Alongside bulimia, I developed anxiety and depression with a great big dollop of struggling with my body image, which brought on more disordered eating alongside the bulimia. Struggling with body image became the main driver for my eating disorder, and this continued into my 20s, and something that still affects me now. However, I'm so much more comfortable in the skin I'm in. I hated looking in the mirror at myself, and I had a negative voice whispering in my ear in my reflection. I felt that the concerns I had with my body image weren't worth sharing. And after a science class at secondary school that covered eating disorders in a very stigmatizing way, I shut myself away even more with my thoughts and my eating disorder. I was embarrassed and became even more ashamed after visits with my dentist. I didn't have the same care for me as I would for a friend. I was always punishing myself. Over the years, I've had some very dark times that are hard to talk about. And as time's gone on, I've had other points of dark times, but I know now the importance of reaching out for help and not suffering in silence. And as the saying goes, a problem shared is a problem halved. And it's so important to have a toolkit of things to help you. And then I think as well, when it comes to judgment, it's so important to use that energy of judgment, but as awareness for looking inwards and outwards at others. I spent years isolating myself, bottling everything up, feeling like I couldn't go on my own, suffering, feeling embarrassment about everything. Attitudes would change towards you if you did open up, and hearing the way things were expressed that made you feel like you would want to keep shut up for good. The public stigma and self-stigma had made me feel like I would be weak if I shared what was really going on. But I've come to discover that when you overcome that stigma, you are so much stronger when you reach out and share your mental health difficulties. So I think when it comes to the impact that stigma had on my experience, I felt shame, I felt isolation, I felt lonely, and I felt like it was something that was so easily dismissible. I felt there was so much miscommunication as well. It made me feel petrified of getting help or acknowledging that something was wrong because I didn't know what help looked like. I thought if I sought help, I would be locked up for good. I thought if I spoke, it would be seen as attention seeking. And when I was questioned if everything was okay, I lied. If my behavior was questioned, I lied. The dishonesty made me feel even more guilty. My eating disorder was concealed because of stigma until I got help. There's so many myths and misconceptions about eating disorder. The science class I mentioned earlier was like Eating Disorders 101 for covering the myths and misconceptions of an eating disorder, especially when bulimia was explained. And I think the biggest myth about eating disorders is that it's just a phase that's easily dismissible or it's something being done for attention. And yeah, thanks so much for listening in to me and letting me share with you today. I really appreciate your time. And yeah, to learn more about Sea Change, Sea Change have a website, www.seachange.ie, and they're on plenty of places across social media as well, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So if you put Sea Change or Sea Change Ireland into those platforms, you'll be able to find them. And then they also have a podcast as well. And yeah, just to finish off there, now when I catch my own eye in the mirror, I love the person that looks back at me. I think she's pretty cool. I think if I don't love myself, then how can I expect someone else to? So, yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Brodie, for being our first speaker this evening and for sharing your journey. Our second speaker is Aoife Foran, who I'll introduce to you now. Aoife has a background in psychology and sociology and is currently a PhD student with the Department of Psychology, University of Limerick. Her project is titled Harnessing Groups for Health, Eating Disorder Recovery, as supported by everyday groups. The project focuses on how group processes can both facilitate and hinder eating disorder recovery related outcomes. Aoife has an interest in stigma, social identity, and eating disorders, which is what she will focus on in her presentation now. Okay, Aoife.
Thanks so much, Jacinta. My name is Aoife Foran, and I'm a final year PhD student at the Department of Psychology, University of Limerick. My research is funded by the Irish Research Council, and it examines group processes and eating disorder health outcomes, with a particular focus on the role of stigma and social identity. My research is supervised by Dr. Aisling O'Donnell and Professor Orla Muldoon. So to start off, a bit about the stigma of eating disorders. So stigma is an unfortunate reality for people living with an eating disorder. And stigma is often defined as an attribute, behavior, or reputation which is socially discrediting in a particular way that may cause an individual or a group of people to be perceived by others in terms of an undesirable and rejected stereotype. So when a person is diagnosed with an eating disorder, they not only take on the associated stigma of an eating disorder diagnosis, but they are also categorized together with others who have also received a similar diagnosis. But the stigma associated with eating disorders is different compared to other psychological disorders such as depression. And this is because the behaviors associated with eating disorders are often normalized or accepted in society. This is because Western culture allows us to believe that some extreme forms of eating behaviors, such as restrictive dieting, are appropriate ways to achieve the ideal body, or what is commonly known as the thin ideal. However, the pendulum swings when this high status thin ideal is transformed into a low status eating disorder diagnosis, and this often results in stigmatization. Unfortunately, eating disorder stigma is cited as the strongest barrier to help seeking and recovery. So people with eating disorders experience different types of stigma. Eating disorders are often seen as a lifestyle choice, with the public often trivializing an eating disorder as being within a person's control, and this is an example of perceived stigma. This can lead to people with eating disorders experiencing blame, discrimination, and social rejection, and this is known as enacted or experienced stigma. Over time, these experiences may result in people with an eating disorder to avoid seeking help due to a fear of continued stigmatization for having an eating disorder, and this is an example of anticipated stigma. The stigma associated with an eating disorder diagnosis may allow people to feel labeled by their eating disorder, and this leads to the internalization of experiences of stigma. So how is stigma related to health? In the stigmatized identities and chronic illness literature, stigma has been associated with reduced psychological well-being, higher avoidance of social interactions, reduced quality of life, impaired physical health, and decreased likelihood of future help-seeking behaviors. Although the stigma has been associated with eating disorders, the impact that this may have on eating disorder recovery-related outcomes has not received as much attention, and we argue for the application of this knowledge in order to improve recovery trajectories. So, together, me and my supervisors conducted a systematic review, which is now published in the European Eating Disorders Review, and we wanted to examine, does the stigma associated with an eating disorder impact the possibility of recovery? So the overall findings of our review suggest that stigma does in fact have an impact on the possibility of eating disorder recovery, and this is because different types of stigma are associated with poor psychological, social, and physical health outcomes, greater eating disorder psychopathology, and decreased likelihood of treatment-seeking behaviours. This was shown across different studies, and this was the effect held across different types of stigma and recovery-related outcomes. Our findings also underscore prior arguments that physical, behavioural, psychological, and social factors should be included in definitions of eating disorder recovery as well. Stigma is often viewed as a detrimental characteristic that gives an individual a tainted or devalued identity based on their belonging to a certain group. So stigma is often viewed as a negative social identity. In living with this stigmatized identity, group members can engage in group-based coping strategies. This includes identifying more with the stigmatized group, and group membership can trigger protective features of group memberships, and this buffers against the more negative outcomes of stigma, so the impact of stigma on health. On the other hand, people can also move away from the group and attempt to protect themselves by avoiding the stigmatized identity. So people with an eating disorder may feel a greater sense of belonging with their family or friend group rather than an eating disorder therapy group. We know that positive group memberships have shown to protect against the detrimental effects of stigma on health, and it can be said that group identification allows us to access health-related benefits, such as the receipt of social support and access to group norms. Another challenge for people with eating disorders is periods of life transition. And so we aim to examine how identity processes can protect people during these periods of life transition. So we chose to look at the university transition as this adjustment period is a major challenge for young people as it involves a natural change in meaningful connections. Young people with eating disorders are at particular risk during this period of transition and may report compromised health outcomes. So there is a need to understand how we can manage this period of transition so as to protect people's health. We know based on the social identity approach that people's social connections and the identity-related behaviour they derive from them are important for promoting positive health outcomes. This approach has explored the role of therapy and support groups in eating disorder symptoms, but has paid less attention as to how meaningful everyday connections supported by affiliative identities impact eating disorder symptoms. So what we mean by affiliative identities are identities based on belonging, so groups of people who are an important part of who we are. This social identity approach has actually been done on Bodywhys support groups, and it has shown the benefits of people with eating disorders attending these support groups in order to promote eating disorder recovery. So we conducted a cross-sectional study examining this period of transition to understand how these identity processes can promote positive eating disorder health during the university transition. This research is now published in the Journal of Eating Disorders if anybody is interested in looking at it at a later date. And what our findings show is that meaningful everyday connections as facilitated by these affiliative identities, so family or friend networks, some people chose to select, perhaps sports teams, or other people decided to select groups like their work friends. So these types of groups were shown to have positive implications for eating disorder symptoms during this transition period. And this is because the social support received from these connections is associated with how people perceive group norms around disordered eating. So people with these connections, if they felt supported by this group, were less likely to believe that this group was trying to endorse disordered eating behaviours. We also conducted a longitudinal study with across a 1.5 year study period. We started in September of 2019, followed up with our participants in January of 2020, and again in January of 2021. So we tracked these people from the beginning of their first year of university to the middle of their second year. And what we were able to show is that greater strength of group identification at the beginning of our study predicted enhanced well-being over time, and also that this greater well-being was associated with reduced self-reported eating disorder symptoms across time. We also showed a mechanism through which this occurred, so that identity strength at time 1, so at the beginning of this period of transition, predicted reduced eating disorder symptoms over time because of this enhancement in well-being. So what practical implications does our research show? So in order to improve eating disorder recovery outcomes, we argue that treatment plans must acknowledge the types of stigma people with an eating disorder experience, with the aim of reducing this stigma, as the stigma of eating disorders is associated with negative recovery-related outcomes. Targeting experienced or anticipated stigma may be beneficial in the clinical management of eating disorders to work through concerns of stigma or internalization. Our findings also speak to the benefits of groups during periods of adjustment or life change, and our findings support the focus in treatment on group-based therapies that create a sense of belonging to address a concern common to all members of the group. We also suggest that group interventions that use affiliative identity as a platform for generating healthy norms around eating, access to functional social support, and the enhancement of psychological well-being might be especially important for reducing eating disorder symptoms. And to give a final summary then, we show that group processes are important in the study of eating disorders. First, our findings highlight that eating disorder stigma has an impact on recovery trajectories because it is associated with poor psychological, social, and physical health outcomes, as well as greater eating disorder psychology and decreased likelihood of treatment-seeking behaviours. Second, we demonstrate that affiliative identity, so people's most important groups, have a positive impact on eating disorder symptoms because of the social support derived from these groups is associated with how people perceive norms around disordered eating. Finally, we show how group identification may act as a form of a social cure for those at risk of exacerbating eating disorder symptoms during periods of life transition because of the relationship with psychological well-being. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Aoife. Some very valuable findings there from your research. So our next speaker is Dr. Ciara Mahon. And Ciara is a postdoctoral researcher in the Youth Mental Health Lab at University College Dublin. Ciara is evaluating mental health outcomes of 20,000 youths who completed the National Irish My World Survey 2. Her PhD, conducted in Trinity College Dublin under the supervision of Professor Heavey, investigated the effects of social media on youth and adolescent body image and evaluated the effectiveness of a novel self-compassion intervention to reduce social media related body dissatisfaction. Ciara is going to talk to us about body image. Okay, Ciara.
Thanks, Jacinta. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to present on the topic of hidden issues in body image at this year's Eating Disorders Awareness Week. Before I begin, I'd just like you to, or I'd invite you to imagine a world where there are no body ideals, where individuals aren't judged or discriminated against based on their appearance, and where there aren't pressures to strive for certain body standards. What would that world look like? It's hard to imagine, given that we live in such an appearance-centric society where body image pressures are ubiquitous and they create hierarchies that divide us. Therefore, the hidden issue that I'm going to discuss today is the disconnection that can be experienced because of negative body image, both at a personal, but also at a relational and societal level. I'm also going to be discussing some hidden strengths that we can draw on, in particular in relation to connections that we can use to foster positive body image and build healthier relationships with our bodies. But first, what is body image? So body image is a multifaceted construct. It involves our thoughts about our appearance, such as whether we're attractive or not, our feelings, so whether we're anxious or have appearance anxiety, and our behaviors. So these can include checking our appearance in mirrors and things like that. And body image can be experienced in both positive and negative ways. And a lot of the research attention has focused on negative body image, and in particular body dissatisfaction, which is globally reported by almost 50% of women and 35% of men. Data from Ireland finds that 44% of Irish young adults were dissatisfied with their body. That's findings from My World Survey 2. And this is about 53% of women and 42% of men. So this highlights how prevalent body dissatisfaction is among Irish youths. And body dissatisfaction is associated with a host of negative outcomes, including low self-esteem and negative affect. It can impact disordered eating and exercise and can give rise to eating disorders. So how does body dissatisfaction occur? And there are multiple different factors that can drive body dissatisfaction, but sociocultural theories of body image and in psychology identify two factors that are associated with body dissatisfaction. One of these is body ideal internalization. So this is when we cognitively endorse body ideals as our own personal body standard. So for example, the thin or lean ideal tends to be the ideal that's endorsed for women, and the muscular lean ideal tends to be endorsed for men. And so a person who's internalized an ideal like this believes that they should be able to attain this kind of ideal personally. Appearance comparisons then are when we compare our appearance to that of another person. And so oftentimes we have a tendency to compare with people who we might perceive as better than us, or upward comparisons. And these upward comparisons can highlight discrepancies between our own actual bodies and our perceived or desired or ideal bodies. And so this can give rise to body dissatisfaction. Many researchers in the body image space would argue that this pressure to attain body ideals and the pressure for perfection has been magnified and amplified in recent years, particularly with our visual and virtual cultures. And particularly with social media, we can see such a profusion of idealized bodies online that it can distort our perceptions of what a normal body is. And this can widen our gap between our expectations and reality and drive body dissatisfaction. So why, given that these body ideals are very difficult or almost impossible to achieve, why do we still continue to strive for these? And there are a number of different kind of motives that have been identified in terms of why we strive for body ideals. In society, in our capitalist societies, we're fed this kind of idea that achieving body ideals will give us a sense of fulfillment, success, happiness. And we're fed the narrative that we will be happier when we have these kind of body ideals. We also live in a culture that values self-improvement, and there's almost a social imperative to be constantly working on yourself to self-improve. And body image is one of these areas where we can target to work on ourselves, and we're often fed a narrative that by working hard enough, we can achieve these kind of body ideals. And some researchers would argue that there's even a moral obligation that individuals who've attained these body ideals are in some way superior, and that individuals who haven't aspired or achieved these ideals are inferior in some way. So there are multiple different drivers of body ideals. But what's common to all of these drivers is that they're creating an element of social inequalities. These ideas are so narrow, and they create these kind of social hierarchies that advantage some and disadvantage others. And these are inequalities that are experienced on a structural level. And these appearance biases can take multiple different forms: discrimination based on body size, skin color, hair type. And one of the more common ones that we see is this idea of weight stigma. So weight stigma occurs when there's negative attitudes expressed towards individuals who have larger BMIs. And there's often the negative and mistaken attitudes that individuals who are of these larger bodies are in some way, they are lazy, or they're not disciplined enough for it. And there's these kind of misconceptions that by shaming people about their bodies, it'll encourage them to change their bodies in some way. And we know that this is categorically not true, and that in fact, experiences of weight stigma can have really detrimental impacts on body image and can negatively impact health behaviors. So this kind of social hierarchy that exists because of body ideals creates a disconnection. And oftentimes we think of body image as an individual problem. But in fact, there are these structural inequalities that drive these kind of concerns. And so a hidden issue is that we need to consider body image as a social justice issue, and not only just at an individual level. Related to this is that we have this other kind of issue that this kind of negative body image can disconnect us from others, because we have these misconceptions about who is and who isn't affected by body image concerns. And so oftentimes we don't dismiss, or we don't understand the concerns of certain groups that haven't received as much media or research attention. And these include people such as individuals with disabilities, individuals of older age, sexual and gender minorities, ethnic minorities, and men. And so for these groups, their body image concerns remain a hidden and underappreciated issue. And so in terms of body image in general, this is a hidden issue that needs to be addressed, and we need to have greater recognition of concerns of all of these groups. So how do we address this kind of social inequality? And we can draw on a hidden strength of connection here to kind of address this issue at a societal level. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes we tend to focus on body image from an individual perspective, and we try to encourage individuals to accept their bodies and to ignore or not place as much investment in body image. And these are really important goals to strive for. But simply telling people to accept themselves or ignore body image is not the only solution when these appearance hierarchies exist. And we need to tackle it at a societal level and dismantle this body image hierarchy and celebrate difference rather than negating it. And while there's been a lot of work done in this area, and we can see greater diversity in representations in the media, etc., there is still a way to go in terms of dismantling all the misconceptions that exist and giving recognition to body image concerns, and dismantling kind of the hierarchies that exist. And this is something that's difficult to achieve, this large scale social change, but it is worth striving for. But it's also compounded by this difficulty in dismissing body ideals at a personal level. And this is because we're socialized and indoctrinated to believe or endorse these body ideals from a very young age. And research has found that infants as young as 3 years of age show body size bias, and that girls show preference for thinner versus wider toys. So we have these kind of beliefs about body image that are ingrained in our psyche from a very young age. And oftentimes we're not even aware of them. And that is a hidden issue that we all experience at a personal level. And that oftentimes we have what's known as the inner critic voice that is driving these kind of negative thoughts about our body image. So, and something that like being like this narrative that we're not good enough, that we're ugly, or that we're not thin enough. This is often a dialogue that we can experience internally and often aren't even aware of it because it's our default way of relating to ourselves. And this inner critic can make it very hard to let go of body ideals and can create a great deal of dissatisfaction with appearance. In terms of individuals who are going through eating disorder recovery, there are unique body image challenges that they face and that can be hidden. For individuals who are on the recovery journey, often there can be a change in physical appearance, and this can be very disconcerting, particularly if it's moving someone away from their perceived ideal. Oftentimes, there's also distorted body image perceptions, such that individuals perceive themselves as smaller or bigger than they actually are. And often this inner critic that I've just described can be highly amplified in individuals who are struggling with eating disorders. Another challenge related to this is that there's often a focus on appearance, and that individuals tend to rely on more external rather than internal cues for indications about hunger or even appearance or weight gain, etc. And so this heightened focus on outside appearance can compound these body image concerns. And oftentimes in eating disorder recovery, there's a focus on the eating behaviors and eating patterns, which is really important. But body image is also something that's really key that needs to be considered. Another challenge that has come to light recently in terms of eating disorder recovery and also promoting body image or healthy relationships with our body is this idea that addressing body dissatisfaction alone is not sufficient, that we also need to build positive body image. And positive body image is distinct from body dissatisfaction. It's a holistic construct that involves accepting, respecting, showing love, appreciation, nurturing our bodies. And positive body image is associated with more favorable psychological outcomes, such as improved self-esteem, higher well-being, all of these kind of things. And so we can draw on the hidden strength of connection with others to build a sense of positive body image. Research has found that connecting with others who accept your body can help build positive body image. And researchers, Ciara and Friesen, tracked people who had moved from a more negative body image to a positive body image. And they identified that having someone who accepted your body, whether that be a partner, a friend, a family member, was a critical or pivotal thing that helped shift perceptions in body image. Finding connections, whether that be in yoga or even spending time in nature, has been found to provide a sense of connection that can help to improve body image. So key to this is kind of finding connections that can help foster body image and connections with others. Another form of connection that's really important to consider in terms of promoting body image is this connection with ourselves, and particularly with our compassionate selves. As I mentioned, we often default to talking to ourselves in critical and derogatory ways. But if we can catch this negative critique and dialogue that's going on inside our heads and flip it and think of ourselves or talk to ourselves in more compassionate ways. And I like to think of it as talking to yourself like you would a friend, particularly when you're going through a difficult or challenging time. And self-compassion has been found to be a powerful promoter of positive body image. So an example of how this might work, for example, we might say, our critical voice might say, you're not good enough. Whereas we can flip this and say, in a compassionate way, you're doing the best you can in the moment, or you're a failure from the critical voice. We can flip this and think, you're learning from your experiences and will do better in the future. So if we can turn to try and identify this critical voice and shift into a more compassionate perspective, we can change the way that we experience body image and foster that greater connection with that compassionate side. So to sum up, I've discussed some hidden challenges associated with negative body image, including the disconnection that it causes in terms of disconnecting us from social equality. It also disconnects us from understanding others, and it can disconnect our expectations from reality and can drive an inner critic that can create feelings of dissatisfaction. But we can also draw on hidden strengths of connection, such as connection by advocating for social equality, connecting with support of others, and connecting, importantly, with our compassionate selves to help us build positive body image and a healthier relationship with our bodies. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions at the end, and these are my details if you'd like more information. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ciara, for that fascinating presentation on body image as a hidden challenge in recovery to eating disorders. So we look forward to exploring that in greater detail at the panel presentation later. So our next speaker is Dr. Aoife O'Sullivan. Dr. O'Sullivan is a GP working in UCC Student Health Department. She has an interest in women's health and mental health. She became interested in eating disorders management in primary care back in 2013 as a result of seeing students with eating disorders and struggling to care for them as a GP. At the time, there were no guidelines or educational programs for GPs in Ireland. She has worked with the National Clinical Programme for Eating Disorders and published guidelines for GPs with the Irish College of GPs in 2021. Okay, Aoife, thank you.
Thank you. I'll just try and get my slides up there now. Okay, so thank you for having me on to speak today. As Jacinta says, I'm a GP working in student health in UCC and also working with the National Clinical Programme for Eating Disorders. So as a student health GP, basically that means I'm employed by the university. All of the patients that I see are students within UCC. So it is predominantly young people between the ages of 18 and 25, though of course there's mature students as well, so it's not exclusive, but a large group of young people. So it's probably a different cohort to what most GPs would see. Mental health is a large part of our job. I think that probably ties in with what Aoife was saying at the start in her presentation, that transition from school into university can be a time that can be maybe a struggle and maybe bring out some mental health difficulties that people can have. Back in 2012, 2013, we identified that we had a probably larger than usual cohort of eating disorder students with eating disorders coming through our service compared to a regular GP, not larger than usual for student health, I'm sure, but relative to a normal GP practice. And we were very much struggling in terms of caring for people with eating disorders at that point, because there was so little education and guidance at a professional level. You'd be surprised how little that doctors actually thought about eating disorders. So just for our own practice within UCC, we did our own research and developed our own guidelines to inform our own practice of this. Through this, I came to the attention then of Dr. Ciara Mahon and the National Clinical Programmes, and over a period of a couple of years, joined in with them to try and bring this work to GPs at large. So I joined the National Clinical Programme for Eating Disorders and also working with the Irish College of General Practitioners to kind of work on education for professionals. So this culminated last year, only about not even quite a year ago, with the launch of the ICGP guidelines, which we did on a webinar, something similar to this. Over 2,000 GPs were in attendance. I think it was pretty well received. And working with Bodywhys as well, actually, because they have a GP booklet too. So this is all kind of to say that really eating disorders have been very much misunderstood, as I'm sure everyone is aware, but also that actually there's been very, up until recently and even still today, that the education and training for doctors hasn't been great. So what are the barriers to accessing care? I mean, we have to mention the impact of COVID-19. I've got some statistics which I'll show in a slide later on in terms of the increase in presentations and increase in hospitalizations of patients with eating disorders. But I think even accessing GP care has been impacted. This is, of course, for safety reasons with COVID, and different practices have taken on different, that really guidance. People have had to make their own minds up. But it has, of course, had a knock-on effect, even though we know it's there for patient safety. So some GPs are doing in person, some people are telephone triage or maybe video consultations. And it can be hard to get an appointment. It can be hard to find a GP these days. There's an increased demand and some practices aren't accepting new patients. So these are all very real barriers to accessing GP care. And even if you have a GP care, there are barriers to accessing specialist care as well in terms of recruitment. Now, with all that in mind, we do know that early diagnosis and treatment of eating disorders leads to a much higher chance of recovery. There's so much research to show this, and by identifying people with eating disorders early and intervening early, we know that we can reduce the chances of it going on to become a more significant disease, maybe reduce the chance of people needing to be hospitalized, which means you're actually saving money in the long run. So it makes a lot of sense for early intervention. But the problem is, in our slightly very overwhelmed medical services in Ireland, intervention often it ends up aimed at those with severe disease who absolutely deserve the intervention and need the care. But this can be missing those then that are at early stages and aren't maybe as dramatic and maybe are quieter and might slip through or slip between stools. So a good analogy I heard recently was a restaurant analogy, to say that, if you're back of house, your kitchen staff are fully staffed and coping with the crowds, then the front of house staff can go out the door and sort of find new customers and bring them in and and get them going. But if the back of house staff are struggling and are barely managing to keep up with the work rate, the last thing they want to do is have the front of house staff searching for new people. And you can apply this to early intervention, that if we're struggling with lack of staffing and struggling to manage workload, it's very hard to do, you know, effective early intervention, but yet we know it is the right thing to do. From a primary care GP perspective, I suppose the visibility, again, for severe anorexia is obviously more visible, and it's probably the image that a lot of GPs have, as well as the general public, of eating disorders. And then other eating disorders, such as other forms of anorexia that aren't quite as severe, of bulimia, binge eating disorder, just aren't as visible, and they can be missed and they can be hidden. You can have obviously eating disorders with a normal weight range. For example, somebody might have lost a lot of weight, but perhaps gone from a BMI, I don't know, 26 down to 20, which is huge weight loss. And yet if they go into their doctor, they might get checked and told, no, you're fine, everything's normal. Again, linking in with what Aoife was saying there, or rather Ciara, sorry, was saying about the sort of body image ideals that I've had certainly students in who have a lot of shame and guilt about maybe their weight, their eating habits, and have really never even thought that this could be a disorder, that this could be binge eating disorder. And actually it's not their fault, you know, it's sort of all the self-blame and negative thinking. Whereas if you kind of say, actually, you know what, maybe this is a disordered eating and there is things we can do and help there, that can be massively helpful, but it's a kind of a hidden thing. Again, the anxiety, the increased anxiety in modern life has caused huge problems. I mean, COVID for the last 2 years now, everything else that's happening in the world. And sometimes people can use eating a coping mechanism for this huge anxiety. And then that can cause conflict, because the abnormal eating or the disordered eating can be a coping mechanism. And then there am I saying, you need to give up this coping mechanism because it's not very healthy for you. And that's a difficult ask, you know, it's a difficult thing. So we need to have replacement coping mechanisms in place for this to replace what we're removing here. So just a little quick bit about what maybe to expect if you are going into your GP. As mentioned, there's a mixture of modalities now for speaking with a doctor. Phone, video, face-to-face, different practices are doing different things. It's absolutely what we're doing. Certainly we're doing a mixed approach in our practice, and often we'll start with a phone conversation, get an idea of the issues involved, or maybe a video consultation if somebody wants to do that, and maybe move then to face-to-face on another day. And that's absolutely fine. You can get a lot of conversation, a lot of information over the phone to start off before you move into the actual in-person consultation. But generally we do need to do that as well, because we'll need to do some checkups as well as speaking. Plus, I think sometimes it can be easier to just to kind of get a sense of where somebody is at when you're talking to them in person. So in the history, we'll talk about, what we could say history is really a chat about the background. So how things have been and what's going on. You know, is there, what sort of eating issues, what anxiety issues, depression, what else is happening in a person's life that has brought them to us today. In terms of examinations, all very straightforward, nothing too wild or wonderful, really. We check usually blood pressure check, pulse for your heart rate, temperature check. We would do a height and weight check. Then maybe we might book you in for blood tests. That might not be on the same day, because we'd often like to do those as morning samples. So we might have a couple of blood tests done as well, just to check things like iron levels, vitamin levels, check the minerals, you know, potassium, sodium, because all of those things can be abnormal with an eating disorder. And it's important to say, though, that even somebody with a relatively severe eating disorder, they can all be absolutely fine. So blood tests are not the be all and end all. It's not good enough to say, oh, your blood tests are fine, you're fine. That's not true. Blood tests can be fine while somebody is still sick. But at the same time, they need to be checked just to see, do we need to do any supplementation? Depending on the situation, we might recommend a dental check. You know, we might say you need to see your dentist. We might organize an ECG, which is a tracing on the heart. Occasionally, we might need to organize a DEXA scan, which is a bone scan to check for bone density, but that won't be for everybody. Once all this is done, then we would probably have the conversation, depending on the scenario, because it's going to be different situations, of referral maybe to counselling or therapy, or in some situations onto eating disorder specialists, which would mean referral onto the hospital. There's child and adolescent, which is for under 18s, and then there's the adult services. So in my situation, we'd usually be referring to adult services. And currently there is no specialist adult services in Cork where I'm based, but this team is, there's going to be, right now there isn't. Whereas in Dublin there would be actually specialists. So there's also a challenge there in that depending which part of the country you're in, we may or may not have actual access to specialist services, and that's just the way it is in Ireland right now. I'm not sure how easy this is to see, but this is just some information from the National Clinical Programme for Eating Disorders, which is made up for this week, just showing some of the increase in presentations, increase in eating disorder presentations and referrals, in diagnoses and treatments. So everything is going up, up, up. Particularly with anorexia, that has been a lot of extra anorexia referrals. And largely in women, even though we know that men absolutely suffer with eating disorders too, but for whatever reason, it's mostly been in women in this past 12 months. There's been increased patients seen by the specialist services, increased patients treated, and yet at the same time, as a primary care not working in the hospital, I know full well there's plenty of people who are still on waiting and still haven't been seen despite all this work that's going on. So the need is always increasing. So that's it for me today. I hope that's a quick little tour of how things have been in primary care and where things are hopefully, you know, the barriers, the improvements that can be made. There is an app, a mobile app that we have developed with the National Clinical Programme with all of this information in it. And I just put the link up there, as well as some links up with Bodywhys and bibliotherapy, which is self-help, which is a particular interest of mine as well. So thank you very much. And I'll go back to you there, Jacinta.
Thank you so much, Aoife, for sharing all that information, and certainly look forward to exploring some of the topics further with you in a panel discussion. Hi, everybody. So welcome back from our comfort break, back to our Hidden Challenges webinar for Eating Disorders Awareness Week. So our next speaker is Dr. Una Foye, who is a research associate at King's College in London. Her PhD at Ulster University explored the role of emotional intelligence in the onset and maintenance of disordered eating. Dr. Foye has published and presented a number of papers to help develop an understanding of how we can utilize emotions within interventions and within recovery. Most recently, she was awarded an LSI Centre for Mind public participation grant to develop a public event using comedy as a creative approach to talking about mental health and eating disorders. So Dr. Foye is going to talk to us today about recovery. Dr. Foye.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm going to embarrass myself by trying to share my screen. It's only been 2 years of trying to do this. Here we are. So today I'm going to talk about recovery and present some work that I've done with amazing colleagues, Britt and Tom. So this is on behalf of them today. And really it's about that recovery as a process and how we are exploring that from user experience, really. So just to begin with, for recovery and mental health more generally, I work with amazing colleagues at King's College London who have worked on what is called the CHIME framework in mental health. So this is around a lot of things that we've already been hearing from wonderful colleagues today around things that are important to recovery. So things like connectedness, hope and optimism, identity, meaning and empowerment. But what's interesting about this framework, it's been used in severe mental illness, but whenever I've had conversations with the creators of this framework, they've said it doesn't really apply to eating disorders because it's a bit different. And I think coming across, I think that stigma that Aoife's already talked about in terms of we're not really seen as a mental health problem. It's not really a physical health problem, and it's that odd kind of in-between position. So to put it in context in the eating disorder recovery literature, recovery and remission rates vary really greatly, and data suggests anywhere between 25 to 84% of people will say that they have recovered. So it's not a 100% thing, and I think a lot of us who work within either the third sector or in health services find that there's a high relapse rate and also quite high rates of people who would not necessarily consider themselves fully recovered. And I think that in and of itself is a massive conversation that we could have. But in terms of what recovery means, those definitions are still kind of not really sure. There's no one standardized operational recovery. And actually, if you ask some treatment providers or researchers or patients, you'll get 101 different versions of what recovery is. And the expectations are often in terms of what a GP or a clinician might think is that kind of you gain weight and you have no longer the behaviors and you're recovered. But I think whenever we talk about recovery from more of that service user perspective, a lot of us would say it's really a lot more complicated, just as the picture on the right would show. So what could recovery be? So when you look at the literature, it varies so widely. So it could be weight restoration, so having a BMI over a certain point, having the disappearance of disordered behaviors. Is it when we go back to eating normally? And I say that as someone who has always been a fussy eater, nothing to do with my eating disorder. But what is normal eating? Is it about having a mood increase or depression disappearing? Is it not being a risk? Is it just healthy bloods? Is it looking a certain way? Well, we still don't know. And what prompted a lot of this work back in 2019, 2020 with Britt and Tom and other colleagues was that the International Journal of Eating Disorders wanted to try to see if we could find a universal definition of recovery. And what we found from previous research is that actually what clinicians and researchers may think in terms of what recovery is not always what the patients and the service users think. So there is a disconnect by what recovery goals may be between the professionals and the service users. And that's actually really worrying, especially when we don't have necessarily that framework that mental health has or that medical network that would actually fit in terms of what individuals think. So what we wanted to do was see what service users think, and we wanted to do that in kind of unbiased, unfiltered view. So we thought we would use an exploratory approach that used Reddit and used what individuals think through their own kind of conversations and thread in Reddit. And I have to say, I'm too old to understand how Reddit works. So we had a wonderful colleague, Duncan, who helped with this. And I will never claim to understand what Reddit does or how it works. I just did the analysis. But we wanted to see how that was. So it was unsolicited, unfiltered, and really just looked at what people felt recovery was to them and how they would put it in their own words. So extracted from 3 different Reddit threads, if I'm saying that right. And we did some analysis of that data in a very inductive approach. Really, all of it was coming from the words of individuals, and we used that and really took it from there. And just to put it in context, it didn't feel like it was going to be much work because 3 threads, but there were almost 3,000 comments that we did analysis on that were published in 2017, and we've done the analysis the year after. And of those, the majority of individuals had at least one part of the thread that they put words and used one theme of recovery. And in total, there were almost 300 commenters. So the same people often commented quite a bit, and it was an average of about 200 words per comment. But some people spoke quite a bit, some people said less so. And we used a self-diagnosed kind of recovery. So it was however someone wanted to define themselves in their recovery. As I kind of mentioned earlier, I think that kind of how we define recovery and management of kind of behaviors and so forth. So we thought we would let people self-define, and the majority felt they were in recovery, but we also had other people who thought they were fully recovered versus people who felt that they weren't engaging in any recovery themselves. So what we found was there were some significant themes there in terms of the process, in terms of the cognitive and affective factors, and then looking at other things in terms of behavioral, physical, some of that medical stuff, and then the social factors. And I'm going to hit on each of these and give a kind of brief overview. And I have to say, what's really lovely about this webinar today is that a lot of the things that have been coming up in our work around recovery are things that others have mentioned. So things like connection, identity, having social life, and different things like that, that are within those factors holding people back, or why individuals might develop kind of issues around body image. There are also things that we can then flip around and turn into, well, actually, they're really helpful for recovery. So the first theme that we looked at was recovery as a process. And this was the central theme and the most prominent that we had, that everything is a bit of a process. So regardless of where they felt that they were on in their kind of journey, individuals felt that was a process that had lots of stages, and it wasn't necessarily a linear path. It was something that kind of took time and effort, and there were ups and downs, a bit like snakes and ladders, I think was what one person put it as, and that there is no one size fits all. So the definition of recovery is really personalized and individual to each person. And I think that that's not rocket science necessarily, and I think that's something that we would probably all say in terms of wherever we are in our own personal experiences or where we are in terms of our professional experiences. But I think it's something that we have to remember is that it's very personalized. And the same reason that my experience of disordered dating will be very different to someone else's and someone else's and someone else's, that we have to see recovery in the same way. And furthermore, what was reflected is that part of that process is not necessarily reach an end goal and that being the end of it. So you reach A to B, it's that constant process. So it was seen that relapse is a normal part of recovery. And I think that that can be downheartening, but I also think that one really take-home message from that kind of practically is that it's less about us thinking that you get to that point and it's over. It's about, as was just mentioned, it's about having other coping mechanisms and finding ways to be able to deal with the downs of life, because that constant process is happening and life can be difficult. If anything is we've seen in the last couple of years, life is really odd and different things happen, and it's about being ready for that process and being ready for whatever life throws at us. The next theme was that there are psychosocial factors. So to kind of break that down, it's that there are different aspects that are positive to recovery that we'll just touch on. So the first is the cognitive and affective factors. So many commenters looked at how recovery was kind of a free from those negative effects and the feelings of guilt and the compulsion to have rituals and the preoccupation. So all those thoughts, that cognitive stuff is all the thinking that you have around it. That almost obsessiveness that takes over your life in some experiences. Having that gone is kind of part of the recovery, or having even just little periods of not having that. And I think that that's something just to put in context of the previous theme was that it's looking about that process. But it's not necessarily that recovery you will get straight into that those behaviors and thoughts are gone. It can be maybe if you just have half an hour without those thoughts that you can be like, oh wow, I was able to watch an episode with friends. So those sorts of things were really important to people, and seeing those steps in the process were really happy for people. And as one commenter kind of described, there were positive parts of that where they were able to feel a sense of happiness or authenticness and connection to others, but also being able to connect with painful emotions. And as was kind of mentioned in the really cringy biography that I provided, a lot of my work has been around emotion, and I think that that connects with that work in terms of a lot of the time underlying eating disorders in all types of eating disorders can be that wanting to regulate the emotions through the disordered eating, or wanting to repress those emotions, not feel them or express them, and actually being able to get back to a place of feeling emotions is part of the process of recovery. And I think it's a really important part of that recovery process, because we then need to be able to help individuals in their treatments to understand what feeling those emotions is and how to manage it. So if you take away the kind of eating disorder crutch, we still need to help people be able to cope with those emotions, because that's what life is. So then there's also another theme around the behavioural and physical factors. So of course there is always going to be a space for those more medical kind of aspects. So for individuals, they did talk about the fact that there were medical reasons they knew they were recovered, so having certain bloods and certain BMIs, but also was their body being able to function properly. So being able to re-engage in activities and sports that individuals found useful and part of their identity was also something that was really important for individuals during their recovery. And I think, again, it comes to that one size doesn't necessarily fit all, that we all have different parts of kind of our lives that come back in recovery, and by gaining those things that was really important. And one thing that is often hidden, I think, within those conversations around recovery that don't really get hit on is that social and relational factors. And I think that it's really great that all the other speakers have kind of linked this in, but a lot of the importance to recovery and those outcomes were that individuals felt they were able to re-engage in relationships with either people they had had relationships before, be that family or friends, or new relationships, and being able to have a romantic relationship. And I think that was really interesting in the previous talk, where we heard that actually being able to have your body image being celebrated by a partner, for example, can be really helpful in that recovery process. And I think one of the really hidden parts of recovery can be in terms of relationships and regaining sexual life as well. It's something that we all feel a little bit cringy about and a really bit difficult. And that's something that did come up, is that individuals felt that having a sex drive, having that back, was something that was really important for the recovery, and something that just didn't exist when they were in the middle of their eating disorder. But it is something that I think clinicians and researchers find really difficult, because, you know, in that kind of very, you don't talk about it, we're very repressed kind of, I come from a Northern Irish Catholic family. We don't talk about that sort of stuff. So it's a very hidden thing, but it is part of the process and can be very triggering for individuals. And I think particularly when you have your webinar with the kind of Russ Delderfield and others around male eating disorders, that's a really big trigger for some men in terms of regaining that kind of masculinity and kind of sexual feeling, because that can often be quite a trigger in terms of feeling really isolated from where they want to be in their lives. So I think that'll be a really interesting question if anyone is going to be talking in Russ talk. So just to sum up some of this, I suppose what the take-home message for me when we did this work was that it's not really an easy process and everything's a little interlinked. So that's why I chose this image, because that's how I felt recovery really was summed up. So it's pretty much a complicated piece of work. Everything interacts. It's not as easy as just saying, well, as soon as you reach A, B, or C, that you've reached recovery. It's kind of the biological, the social, the psychological, and it pulls in all those elements of who you are as a person and who you want to be as a person. Because I think one thing that I think we can all link to is kind of this COVID scenario where it's kind of going back to normal, is that process that we're talking about. And I think it's a really good way of looking at recovery, is that recovery isn't necessarily about going back to the way things were. It isn't necessarily going back pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and everything is just as dandy and we just forget it ever happened. What we have to do is keep going forward. And I think recovery is just like that it's not forgetting the past, but becoming the person that has experienced that and going forward with it and bringing in all those social, psychological, biological parts. And I think actually the lived experience side that's coming through in a lot of eating disorders work, eating disorders research, clinicians, all of that is so helpful to make there be a meaning in what we have experienced. And that's where I really think the CHEM framework sits with us. And it's ongoing, it's multifaceted, it's something that you kind of sometimes have to keep working at, is what really came out. And I think that for any of us to be mentally healthy needs work. And I think that a lot of these conversations are not necessarily about recovery from mental health, it's for mental illness. And for any stage of mental illness, we need to continue working on that, because just as you keep kind of working out to make sure you have a healthy heart or a healthy body, we have to keep working on our healthy minds as well. And I think just my last kind of slide, because I think I might be going over time, is just that recovery as a field has no absolute, and actually recovery should be defined not only by the absence of eating disorder behaviours or thoughts, but also by the presence of really positive psychosocial functioning and kind of improved states of that health and wellness. And I think a lot of these recovery conversations should focus on mental illness to mental health, and we need to change some of those conversations, not necessarily about kind of, do you have mental health? It should be about, are you mentally well? So that is just a very snapshot of some of that work that we've done, and also some ranting from me about how I view recovery. But if you want to contact me and have any questions, please do let me know. I'm happy to send a paper on. And on behalf of Brett and Tom, thank you so much for listening to me. And now you have to watch me try and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Una, for that fascinating insight into recovery as a process. And we certainly look forward to exploring some of the topics further with you. So now for our final contributor to our Hidden Challenges webinar this evening, I'm pleased to introduce Sheila Naughton, who is a broadcaster and presenter. She recently became the head of news at Tip FM after 3 years in lovely Monaghan with Modern Sound. Sheila is 27 and she has a cat child called Pippa. She is in recovery from anorexia and has been for about 4 years. Over the years, she's experienced many different eating disorders and at times depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges connected often to her eating disorder. After 2 inpatient stints, a lot of outpatient care and hard work, Sheila is well on the road to living a much freer life and now wants to help others through events like this. Okay, Sheila, over to you.
Hello, and thanks so much for having me. I usually always, anyone who's seen me talk before, start with a joke, but instead I'm just going to tell a very short story, because I think sometimes when we talk about mental health and especially eating disorders, we think that people can't have a laugh. But I just want to say that I remember when I got very, very sick and was refusing to get help, we were all sitting on the couch one day and that big snow came and all the shops were cleared out of all the food. And we saw the broadcast on RTE and Dad just turned to me and he went, "Oh, we'll all starve." And I went, "Oh no." So, and we all laughed. So just wanted to put it out there that you're still a person and have a personality and humor when you're sick. I think sometimes we forget about that, and these talks can sometimes get a little heavy, and this will. So keep that with you. So I suppose I was just introduced there. I'm Sheila. I am the head of news down at Tip FM. I've just moved to Tipperary, so a time of change in my life, which can be quite triggering for me, but I am happy to report that I'm starting to settle a little bit, and I haven't let any of the behaviours that wanted to come back in come back in. I'm a Sea Change ambassador, and as I also was said there, I do that because I would love if I had heard somebody speak about eating disorders and I knew that I was unwell before I got to the stage of well, I suppose being close to dying. So I you know, the stigma I put on myself and others put on me, I would like to kind of get rid of that for others and hopefully help people get help sooner. I don't want to tell my story in too much detail because it's very long, but in brief. So I suppose when I first started showing signs of an eating disorder, I was 7 years old. I stood on a scale for the first time in my granny's house. To this day, I remember the numbers that showed up. I remember the sound of the scale. It wasn't until later that I realized that kind of the impact that had on me, and there was an awful lot of discussion when I was younger about my granny's weight, and weight was often discussed. 11, my mother remembers me pulling at my stomach in the mirror to try and make myself look thinner, I would often ask, "Can you see my ribs?" But yet, like, this was never paid attention to, but I was doing these things. I then got to secondary school and I would have developed quicker than some of the other girls. I also was quite sporty, so I was quite muscular, and I got bullied quite severely by boys. But I was called She-Man. I was told to go to Weight Watchers. I was told that I had man legs, like all these things, to the point that I would I wouldn't wear a skirt for my whole time in school. I wore trousers the whole time, but I always put on the best mask, to the point that now I'll meet people who know I've been unwell and will say, "I always thought you could handle it." So, you know, these things can have a lasting effect, even if you're showing if there's any parents here, even if the child is showing that they're strong and that they're well able to deal with it, it can come back in, you know, to impact you later in life, as mine did. I started my first diet then when I was in 5th year. That meant cutting out some food groups. It meant being really particular about when I ate. I wasn't restricting too much or anything like that, but I was on a diet. And then finally, then I got to college, and we heard a little bit about college and things there and the transition over. And it was this idea of, if you're going to be successful in college, well, that also includes being successful and in terms of being small and fit and healthy. So I fell for every bad diet and supplement that you could think of. For someone that was meant to be an intelligent girl, I could be deceived by everything. I bought them all. I would say if I could have saved all that money, I'd be able to buy a new car. But I was obsessed with clean eating. So I would only eat things that I considered clean eating. I was, this beacon of health. And I looked fine. So I actually probably looked the best, and again, quotes, I'd ever looked, which is a hugely dangerous thing as well, when your thoughts aren't healthy. But it was when I left college that things just spiraled. All those things just that I've mentioned, I realized them through therapy. So let's come to 2016, 2017. At this stage, I was out of college. Everyone told me I had everything going for me. But I just felt I wasn't good enough. I felt that everything I was doing wasn't good enough. I decided to focus on my body, and that meant restriction became my life. Exercise became my life. I would work out. It could be, hours upon hours a day. I became so unwell, I could no longer work. And eventually my dad saw a picture of me and didn't recognize me. And that's when the intervention happened, and they arrived at my house in Dublin, and I was taken home. At this stage, I was 23. So you can imagine it's very difficult to tell your adult child what you're doing. I've just been told I only have 3 minutes. Oh God, I better fly through. Okay, so this is when basically I began my road to recovery. I went to my GP first, and I was referred, but I took the letter and I put it in a drawer, and eventually my parents had to do it for me. Look, you half want help, you half don't want help. So I didn't really want to do it, but I also knew I couldn't keep living the way I was living. Like, I couldn't bear to wake up every day, because I knew that the same cycle was going to happen again and again. To the point that one day I remember walking across the road and thinking, well, if a car hit me, at least it would be, at least I wouldn't have to live with this little voice anymore. So when getting a diagnosis, that was probably the most shocking thing. It was realizing, this is a real thing. And I should say it wasn't anorexia at the start. It was EDNOS. I think it's called something else now. But for any professionals that are listening, the reason I ended up with anorexia was that I was constantly told that the numbers didn't match up, and that they couldn't understand the numbers because they were too high. So I pushed myself to the point that they weren't too high. Just shows how damaging that can be. I was inpatient twice, as we said, and I was discharged after 5 weeks and told I wasn't ready for recovery. And I remember at Christmas of 2017 into 2018, I looked at myself in the mirror one day, and I just remember thinking, I don't recognize that person. And it was like the first time I had seen myself. I had never seen what other people could see until that moment. And I said to my mum, I need to go back in. And that was the time I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. I felt like a failure that I had to go back, because to my mind, I was out. I was doing well, but I wasn't. But all I would say to anybody is, you're not a failure if you have to try again. You are the bravest person if you go in again, because that is the hardest decision that I ever made. And every time you choose to go back to recovery, no matter where you are never starting again. And you are so, so brave for doing that. And it's not easy. So anyone who's supporting someone going back in is not a failure on anyone's behalf. It's the brave thing to do. I needed family support. I then needed outpatient care. When you get out of hospital, that's when things get tough, because you're out of the bubble. So then that's when you need counseling. You need a dietitian. I have a nutritionist. I have a coach to tell me how I can exercise. I had to snip out in the middle of that break and have my dinner, because I eat on a clock still. Lots of things are around me in terms of support, and I tried everything. I won't go into details, because what worked for me mightn't work for someone else, but all I would say is explore every avenue. If you're told eating disorder patients don't usually do this treatment, well, maybe it'll work for you. So just keep trying. You have to really want to, you just can't give up, basically. And don't get me wrong, I had slips. My uncle died during COVID. and I restricted again. But I had the family support around me who turned to me and said, we know you're not doing well. You go home and look after yourself. And I pulled it back again. If I'm stressed, it happens. If I stand on a scale, it happens. So I can't have scales near me. What it means to live with one now is very different to what it was. Before, it meant that I almost just didn't want to keep going, and I felt like it could never get better. Now it means that occasions can be difficult, family occasions, meals out. I have daily battles with will I or won't I eat, but I should say that I always win now, and I always do, because I stick to my plan, and that gets easier with time. I have body dysmorphia. I do not see what other people see. Even now, I don't see what other people see. And I do have feelings of inadequacy quite a lot that can slip into every part of my day, to the point that I sometimes wonder why people would want to be around me. But I have to say that you have to reach out. And I reached out, and I didn't even want the help, and someone had to go and do it for me, but I still reached out. And if you have an eating disorder that isn't that visible, then you have to be really brave, and you have to actually ask for help. But also, for anybody listening, they have to be heard. So if you're a doctor, if you're a parent, if you're a friend, they have to be heard. Do not tell them it's a phase. Don't tell them, oh, well, you look fine. I was once told by a professional that I looked in proportion. Like, guys, we just need to really watch our language, because reaching out is really tough. But parents and doctors and people, listen and hear them. I'm kind of coming to the end. You'll be glad to hear, because I'm sure I'm running out of time. But I just have some advice that I'd like to give. So if you're a parent, first thing I would say is, I know that this is horrendous to have to watch this happening, and know that you can't make it better. And that's the truth. My parents were told, if she wants to die, you can't stop her. And that's awful to hear, but that's the truth. But you have to trust that with your support, and not putting pressure on, like, quick, get back to college, quick, get back to school, you need to do the leaving cert, you need to get a job. No, I was told by my parents, your job is to get better. And that was the most helpful thing I ever heard, because oftentimes when you have an eating disorder, you feel like you're lazy and you feel like you're doing nothing anyway. So if someone encourages that by saying, yeah, you really should get a job, then you're going to slip backwards. So just be supportive, but you cannot make them better. You can just ease the burden. Person who's going through it, just know that it's okay not to find your fit immediately. I remember hearing, we've done everything by the book, we don't know what to do with her. And I thought, well, throw the book out. Like, let's try something else. So I just kept on trying. I said yes to everything. Sheila, do you want this therapy? Yes. Sheila, do you want to try this outpatient care? Yes. Some worked, some didn't. I went through 6 counsellors till I found the woman that I've been with now for 4 years. It's okay. It's okay to keep trying, because that's you trying to save yourself. And that's amazing. And finally, I suppose, to any of the professionals that are listening, please talk to us. Tailor plans for us. We're all individual. We all have our own personalities. Like, I was as feisty as anything when I was sitting in that hospital, and they had no clue what to do with me. But maybe if they considered what I was actually like, and that I reject being told what to do and I'll go against it, but rather if I'm asked what I'd like, I'm more likely to comply. Like, work with us and find out who we are, rather than saying we're doing it by the book. And also mind your language and stereotyping, because it can be hugely damaging. The benefits of recovery, just to finish on a positive note, are that I have a job that I absolutely love, and it saved me, because I couldn't do my job if I wasn't well. I have friends again, and I feel like my friends enjoy me. I used to feel sorry if my friends happened to be with me. I don't anymore, because I'm like, you know what? I'm probably good crack. Like, they've lasted with me this amount of years. I'm probably okay. Laughing. I didn't laugh for years. Like, yes, I didn't cry, but I didn't laugh. And that was awful. I wouldn't even sing in the car, because I just didn't have the energy, and all that's back. I started weightlifting, which I just love. And it also means that my eating has gotten so much better. So not for everyone, but really worked for me. I'm more flexible, and my social life has gotten better as well. We talked about relationships. Still haven't managed to find one of them, but I can't really blame the eating disorder for that anymore, I don't think. But I also discovered who I am. So maybe I'm not the girl who wants to go out and get absolutely locked and dance on tables like I was in college, but rather I'm the person who's maybe a bit more sensitive, likes arts and crafts, likes baking, and is a cat mom. Maybe that's who I am. But yeah, I would just like to say, being in recovery is so much better than being sick. So no, I'm not recovered, but life is so much better now in recovery. As was pointed out, lots of ways that you can access help. Bodywhys, Shine, See Change, And if you want to contact me on Instagram, more than welcome. Sheila beats Janine, or I should at this stage be saying Sheila has beaten Janine. But anyway, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for being so generous with your time and sharing your journey with us and finishing up on such a positive note. So now I'd ask all the contributors to turn on the cameras for our Q&A discussion. And I think my colleague Ellen is going to manage the questions to the panel. Over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Jacinta, and thank you everyone for your great presentations and sharing your stories. It's really great to hear from everyone. So we do have a few questions. I'll go one by one throughout the group, and we can come back to some questions then at the end. So to start with Aoife, we have a question: is stigma a word that people with eating disorders tend to use or articulate themselves, or do they speak about it in other ways?
I don't think I've ever had somebody say stigma in a consultation to me as that word. So now that's, I mean, obviously I haven't seen everyone with eating disorders, so it's entirely possible, but in my experience, that's word has never been used. But it's more an internalized sense of guilt that does come across, or shame, or worry. So I suppose it's more a sense of the person rather than actually verbalized as that.
Thank you, Aoife. And any of the other panelists have any input on that? No? Okay. So for Dr. Ciara Mahon, given the length of time that there has been a focus on body image concerns, is it only now that the social justice dimension is coming to light, and why might that be?
That's a great question. And I think there has been awareness of the social justice piece for a while, and particularly like feminist movements, early wave feminist movements would have been kind of instrumental in kind of raising these concerns and these kind of social justice inequalities. I think that recently this kind of has gained greater traction and greater attention because we live in a world where there has been a lot of social justice movements in terms of body image, in terms of body positivity, health at every size, and kind of creating greater diversity. So I think there's been more recently an awareness of that, and also research on things like weight stigma, particularly Rebecca Pull's work, is quite recent. So there's kind of growing understanding of these issues. And I raised it tonight because there's a kind of a tendency often to focus on the individual, but we need to consider change at societal and structural levels as well as at the individual level in order to facilitate these kind of changes. But yeah, there has been an awareness of it, but I think it's become more kind of prominent in recent times.
Thanks, Ciara. I can see everyone else nodding along with you there. So Dr. Una Foy, if you wouldn't mind sharing the slide for chime again, as someone missed the definition.
Yeah, so I put in the Q&A, I put a link to a better slide for that, and if I can share it again and talk through it if that's useful.
Perfect, that's great. And just while we're with you there, is there any take-home points around recovery that you'd like people to kind of go home with tonight?
Yeah, I suppose mine too, while I'm trying to work out how to get my slides up again. There are two things that I would probably say is that the first is, and ironically, I'm saying this as a perfectionist, there's no perfect way to recover, and there's no right answer for it, and it's about finding what works for you and finding who you are, who you want to be, and kind of playing around with that. And the second, I think, is probably more aimed at professionals and kind of thinking about we need to find what the positives about the eating disorder can be, because that's how we can unlock the recovery aspect. Because what is that eating disorder doing? Because that's what we need to help and provide the right coping mechanisms with, so that someone can then feel more able to deal with the ups and downs of life. And I think that kind of what Sheila and Brodie both said, and when they were talking, is kind of those aspects of finding who you are and kind of those aspects that make you you. But I think sometimes we don't necessarily see the positives in the eating disorder, and I think that's our key unlock for finding what's positive recovery. And I'm just sharing that slide for the CHIME framework. There's also a link for a better definition, but it's just kind of around connectedness, hope and optimism, particularly around the future, identity, and I think that was a big one for eating disorder recovery. Finding meaning in life, so that's also kind of brings in things around in terms of kind of social aspects, employment, occupation, those sorts of things, and then empowerment, which has a whole load of things within it. So if anyone is particularly interested in it, please email me. I'd be more than happy to kind of share the wider definitions and those sorts of things. And I think one more take-home message is don't be afraid to take medication. I think that's something that we always talk about. Talk more, talking therapies, and what saved my life was taking antidepressants. So I think sometimes don't be scared of that.
Thanks, Una. So for Aoife Foran, we have, what were some of the meaningful connections that people noted in the research?
Yeah, so what we were interested in looking at was identities based on belonging. So these groups of people who are an important part of our everyday lives, you know, that they may not always be within our conscious awareness, but during periods of transition or mobilization, they become active. So a lot of the people would have suggested family as a big, most important connection. School friends as well, because they were at the beginning of the transition to university. So school friends would have been a big part of their lives. A couple had already suggested college friends. So this move had changed their most important group already. And then other people had suggested groups like work friends, sports teams, swim club friends. You know, so we allowed participants to categorize the group that was most important to them. So those were the types that were most important in this group of people.
Thanks, Aoife. That's really interesting, the diverse different groups that people mentioned there. So for Brodie, we have a question here. Is there anything that you'd like to see more research on?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think it would be great to see more research on the disgrace which people place on a person with mental health. So that's your stigma. So the stigma reduction, and that's the public stigma, and then also the self-stigma. But like, I think in regards to that, like in 2020, 50% of people would consider hiding a mental health difficulty from family and friends. But there's actually been an increase in that since 2017, where 38% of people would consider hiding their mental health difficulty. So that's a 12% increase. And yeah, like, I think what's concerning is that more than ever, people are concealing their mental health issues from family and friends. And, you know, you've got 1 in 4 people that would delay seeking treatment if people might find out. So I think definitely that reducing the stigma.
Thank you, Brodie. And Sheila, just around that same question, is there anything that you'd like to see more research around?
I don't know if it's necessarily research, but what I would love to gauge, and it's because when I was a patient and I would ask straight up questions to professionals, I was sick, so I never got an answer. I used to always think they just thought I was, I don't know. I would love to know what their perception of someone with an eating disorder is. So like, a lot of the time we are stereotyped. I'll give an example. One day when I asked for water, I was told no, and I won't explain, but later to be explained why I couldn't have it. And I was like, do you just generalize all of us? Like, we are all generalized all of the time, and everything another girl did in the ward, obviously I did it too. You know, so I would just love to know, like, when they can anonymously say, this is what I think. So, like, and then maybe we can actually create handbooks, and like, I would love to see a language like handbook created of like, these are things probably not to say. Like, you know, don't tell someone they're in proportion. Like, you know, just to try, but we need to, before we can like develop any of these guidebooks or handbooks or trainings, we need to know what they believe first. So that's what I'd love to know. I'd also just generally love to know in society, if you like did a vox pop style research where you ask other people what they think as well, we can identify the gaps then in people's knowledge, because like, it's great for us all talking, but I would imagine people here, a lot of people are interested in educating themselves. So are we always reaching the people who don't know, and whose child then, or like family member gets unwell and they don't know how to deal with it. So I don't know if that answers your question. And also, sorry, just on the connections thing that you mentioned as well, something that can be hugely beneficial about having an eating disorder is also identifying the people in your life who aren't beneficial for you in your recovery, like someone who you may have been friends with, I mean, for years and thought they were a huge support, and maybe that's not the case. And it can be just as beneficial when you're having an eating disorder. You're often a people pleaser, so you're friends with everyone, and it helps you kind of file it down and realize who is beneficial for you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sheila. So then for Dr. Aoife, is there any way that GPs can ensure that the person with an eating disorder feels their needs are heard?
I suppose one of the things we'd have kind of got feedback from, you know, with the person-to-person research that we did, was that sometimes people with eating disorders, when they attend their GP and the GP decides, for example, that they need a referral, maybe give the letter like Sheila described earlier, and then there can be this big gap between that happening and, as we know, with waiting lists, actually being called to be seen in the hospital. So that space between initially seeing your GP and maybe possibly being diagnosed, or certainly an awareness being raised, and actually being seen by a specialist can be this big kind of wasteland, which could be a couple of months. And if somebody could feel quite lost in that space. So one of the things we've been working on and trying to, I suppose, talk to health professionals about is trying to make sure people don't feel lost while they're waiting, that maybe that there is follow-up with the GP, that they are put in touch with Bodywhys, or given the app, or given some books, maybe regular checkups. Knowing that as a GP, I can't cure somebody with eating disorders. That's kind of, I suppose, frustrating. As GPs, we like to kind of give something out and sort it out, but it's too big. We're only part of a small part of a bigger picture. But making sure that we don't think, I think GPs sometimes can think that there's nothing I can offer here, because we need the psychiatrist, we need the dietitian, we need the psychologist, we need this larger team, and we might think there's nothing we can do. But actually, even just following up with somebody, just checking in, making sure that they have access to the self-help while they're waiting for the hospital consultation can be really useful. And say, just making sure somebody feels heard.
Thanks, Aoife. Una, I see you're typing there an answer to one of the questions that came into the Q&A box. Do you want to answer that on the live, or?
Yeah, I've just answered two. One was around training, and I was just saying that unfortunately I'm one of those horrible people that moved to London, so I can only talk about things here, but the South London Maudsley team do a lot of training in terms of mantra and different approaches. So someone had asked about types of therapy training, so that was my suggestion, but I'm assuming that Bodywhys also will know a lot of training in the local areas around Ireland. Beat also have different trainings and those sorts of things that you can access. Again, as a horrible Londoner. And someone else had asked about brain injury, and while that is completely out of my ballpark and I have no understanding, I know there's been lots of research done around brain chemistry and neurological kind of structure and stuff like that, that is really starting to link in around the impact that neurology and neuropsychiatry has in terms of eating disorders. I in no way understand any of it, and I'm not smart enough to do that, but if you are interested in that and would like to know more, I can link in with some people that I do know, so do just email me as well, but I will have to hand that over to the neuro people.
Does anyone else have any kind of input around that on the panel? Okay, so I think that's all the questions for today. Thank you all, and I'll pass you back over to Jacinta for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you all for the questions. It was really fascinating to see the different range of queries to explore. So I suppose at this point for me, it's really just to wrap things up and to sincerely thank our panel for your generosity of time and sharing your insights with us. We'll do our best to get the recording of the event online as soon as possible, and also to remind you that we have the next event in this series on Thursday evening of this week. So that's March 3rd at 7, and it focuses on men's experience in eating disorders. So if you haven't already done so, you could go onto the Bodywhys website and sign in. So I think you'll agree with me, it's been an excellent contribution to Eating Disorders Awareness Week. And again, to thank you all sincerely, and particularly my own colleagues and our partners at Sea Change who brought all of this together. And thank you all for attending, and take care and good night to you all.